Hello! This here is Mr. Magoo is Out to Get You. It's my very first Scratch game from 10 years ago, and I thought it would be fun and interesting to sort of remake it, but as a from-the-ground-up reimagining with my more developed skills and sensibilities. So I started by trying to get a sense of the thematic elements in the original. Granted, there isn't much to work with, but that left me with a lot of creative freedom. Naturally, my first thought was to remake the game in 3D, as I had done with games before. And in less than an hour, I had pretty much done that. Short of the visuals, of course. Not that surprising, and also not that interesting. So, I figured, why not start working on the art and visuals and see if I can't come up with some interesting ideas along the way. Little did I know that working on the art would be a journey in itself. So I made some concept art. Real drawings on real paper inspired by art of the original game, and a sequel that I started working on shortly after the first, but never finished. This is Mr. Magoo, who I didn't know until recently is the name of a famous cartoon character with several TV shows and movies, including a live-action film starring Leslie Nielsen. I'd always assumed Mr. Magoo was just some goofy name you called someone. Nevertheless, I felt this was a good opportunity to change the name of the character and, by extension, the game. So I thought long and hard about what to call him, and out of all the nonsense names that came to mind, my favorite was the King of Fafu, which still maintains the rhythm and rhyme of the original title, but doesn't seem to have any specific prevalent meaning that I could find. Along with the name change, I also did a design change. I'd made a couple of scary face designs before the thought occurred to me. What if I made him a hammerhead shark? A wonderful idea as it turns out, but do not be fooled. A redesign would not be the last of my troubles with this character. But first my priority was giving our protagonist a makeover. According to the original game files, his name is Purper. Sure. Now, I wanted Purper to have a little more going on design-wise, and I decided that giving him a mohawk of frills and a big pair of gumboots ought to do the trick. For a sphere with shoes, I definitely put a lot of time and effort into this model, right down to the UV mapping and vertex lighting. I was just about ready to test the model in-game when I suddenly changed my mind. See, I'd been playing through Metroid Zero Mission at the time, and that game has some very nice pixel art and smooth animations, so I was feeling inspired to make some pixel art animations of my own. Partially because it's something I don't do often, and partially because I thought it would be quicker than modeling and animating every potential character, item, and object in 3D. That part of me was wrong. But there was also another part of me who wanted to try something a little different. Normal maps, an image with colors that represent a direction for each pixel, used to simulate lighting in 2D. Something I'd experimented with before but never fully committed to. What if I made a pixel art game shaded entirely with 2D lights and normal maps? Sounds great, but how do I actually make one of these normal maps? My experience with this in the past was rather limited. Most of the textures I'd found online had normal maps included, and the few times I'd made my own involved baking a complicated mesh onto a simpler mesh in Blender and getting a normal map that way. But I'm using sprites specifically to avoid making everything in 3D. Enter Laighter, a normal map generation tool that works on the simple principle of make it bumpier in the middle and crease it at areas of high contrast, or something like that. It's very simple, but for my needs, very effective. The test went well, and now it was time for me to animate this guy. And, since I no longer had to animate all the lighting, I figured I'd get this done pretty darn quick. In Blender, I can fully animate an idle and a walk cycle animation in just a couple hours. But this alone, took me a full week. I started with the idle animation. Down, left, up, and up. Left the mirroring to Godot. Before this, I had only ever done basic sprite sheets, and now I'm doing all this. Once I'd finished the idle animation, something else occurred to me. This isn't a game where you're going to stop very much. This didn't need to be that smooth. Heck, a single frame probably would have sufficed. But I did it, and now it was time for the walking animation. I used a walk cycle guide for reference and did my best to figure out the angles of the boots. I did pose the model I had of Purper as reference, which helped, but the nuances of pixel art still forced me to spend most of my time just trying every possible idea to see what looked best in motion. But I figured it out eventually. I followed this up by making a simple death animation, and that was that. Just a little advice for anyone hoping to get pixel animation done quickly: don't give your character bouncy frills. I separated each sprite by layer and exported the sheets into Laighter, where I could fine-tune the strength of the bump map effect and then put the character in-game. And boy, did it look good. Too good. It looked more like a 3D animation that had been rendered into 2D sprites, which makes it look like I spent way less time on it than I actually did. Oh well. With that out of the way, I began working on an arena for the character to run around on. In the original game, you just float around in space. But I figured, since I put so much work into animating him running around in his big old boots, that I might as well give him something to run around on. I decided on a hexagonal grid to match the isometric animations of the character, and made a basic sprite to test out the grid system. I wanted this game to take place on a single screen, so it was important that I make a UI to fit this system. I started by looking for a decent pixel font, but I couldn't find anything that I really liked. So what did I do about it? I spent a few hours making my own. This is PixelForge, by the way. I ended up covering all the major English ASCII characters and doing my best to make everything look nice. And now that I've got my own decent looking font, you bet I'm going to be reusing this thing as often as I can. I was continuously jumping between different facets of the game, from the UI to the stage to the enemies and abilities, and this is where I have a confession to make. This is not a remake of one game. It's a remake of two. Though again, barely a remake. This is Sir Raj. Very plain, very similar to Mr Magoo, but with three crucial details. The enemies target you, the enemies duplicate, and the player has a max speed instead of just snapping to the mouse position. These were all elements I had already added to this remake, but these weren't the only things I planned to add. I gotta be honest, my ambitions for this game had been growing, and I was getting more and more ideas. But before I get to that, I'd like to tell you of my biggest struggle yet. And that struggle was creating the King of Fafu. Now, one of the things I'd found somewhat helpful while making the sprite art for Purper was being able to reference the 3D model by seeing what it looked like at different angles. I wanted the same thing for the King. Not to mention, I personally find it easier to design things in 3D than in 2D, so this would also be a good opportunity for me to refine the character's look. This is what I ended up with. Now I could begin the sprite. I used a screenshot from the game as a reference for how big the sprite work should be, and created the outline. Pixel art of this size can be tricky because it's too big to make quick changes like you can with smaller pixel art, but also too precise to ignore little mistakes like you can with higher res digital art. So I worked it out using circles, squares, lines, curved lines, and the occasional bit of eyeballing it. When it was done, I filled it in with colors and removed the outlines. Now it was time for the normals. Oh boy, the normals. Now, you might be thinking, why don't you just use Laighter like you did with Purper? First of all, that's a strange sounding sentence, and second of all, this guy was a little too complex for that. The nose needed to have a sharp ridge, the fins needed to have different thicknesses, and the tail needed to have a distinct flow and curve. If I just used Laighter, I would have ended up with a balloon animal. This led me to do a bunch of studying on how normal maps really work, breaking down the different color channels and learning what it meant to normalize a normal map, and how that actually affects the final look. I also downloaded this normal map combiner tool made by the passive aggressor and tried to figure out how that worked. I looked into a number of different options for creating a normal map for this thing, but the one that seemed like it would be the most efficient with the best result was importing the sprite into Blender, projecting it onto a plane, sculpting the plane into the right shape, and rendering the normal map from there. So, not very efficient. Except I already had a 3D model I could use, didn't I? Nope. Because once again, I'd only eyeballed the model, and then made a bunch of changes after the fact. This thing did not align with the sprite in the slightest, so I would have to make a 3D model again. To summarize, I took a 2D drawing, made a 3D model of it as a reference for a 2D sprite that I then sculpted in 3D so that I could render a 2D image used to make the second 2D image look 3D. And then the render didn't work. It was all blobby. Okay, well, if the built-in normal map baking tool wasn't going to work, I was going to have to recreate it myself. A normal map can be approximated if you would just imagine that it's an image of a 3D model lit red from the right, green from the top, and blue from the front. So, what if I did exactly that, and then turned off shadows, and then set the color mode to linear, and then set the background to a neutral color, and then use directional lights with a negative brightness to light the opposing side of each color so that the normal data would be captured from each side, and then render it with a camera positioned above, looking down. Well, it actually wasn't too bad. I'm kind of surprised how well it turned out, but it wasn't good enough. So I decided to use that render as a reference and then hand draw each color channel in a sprite. No, I didn't. I did not do that. I gave up. I gave that up very quickly. Instead, I went back and I found the problem with the blobby normal map baking. It was the margin. Set that to 0 and we're good. Of course, it was still a little off, so I made a bunch of tweaks, and I actually ended up removing the eyes, cloak, hat, and crown, and using different techniques to create normal maps for them. Then, I used that normal map combine tool from earlier to add them all up, creating the final result. Could it be better? No. No, it couldn't. It's perfect. I'd spent way too much time working on the shark, and now it was time for something else. Gameplay and enemies. And this is where my ideas had gotten a little out of hand. I currently had two kinds of enemies. One that bounced around the screen aimlessly, a la the original game, and another that specifically targeted the player and then duplicated itself when it hit the wall, like in Siraj. But I had ideas for more. More enemy types, more abilities, more complexity for a bigger game. Normally, this is where I would have stopped myself and said just finish up the game and move on. But one of the goals that I recently set for myself was to spend more time making games with some depth to them. Put more work into the actual game design side of game development so that I can actually start making things that are fun. And this is something that was going to take some time. In fact, it is taking some time. So, I'd like to save talking about it for another video. This project was supposed to be done a lot faster, but alas, that's the way these things go, isn't it? Until then, let me know what you think so far. Ciao for now.